Hi, my name is Gabriela Valdivia. I am the director of the current Institute for the Studies of the Americas, soon to be part of a larger hub called Insight. You can think with insight in many different ways. Is it insight here? Is it about having an insight about things? But we will be part of that larger international program, and we'll be Insight Latin American and Caribbean Studies. My name is Gabriela Valdivia, and today it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for today, Professor Aviva Chomsky. She is a historian, an author, and professor at Salem State University, where she's also the coordinator of that American Studies program. She previously was a research associate at Harvard University, where she specialized in Caribbean and Latin American history. Dr. Chomsky has written several books. Her book, West Indian Workers and the United Fruit Company in Costa Rica from 1870 to 1940, was awarded the 1997 Best Book Prize by the New England Council of Latin American Studies. She's also the author of Linked Labor Histories, New England, Colombia, and the Making of a Global Working Class, and the author of They Take Our Jobs and 20 Other Myths About Immigration, which challenges common assumptions and helps readers better understand immigration and its impact. Dr. Chomsky is also the author of Undocumented: How Immigration Became Illegal, which argues that illegality is a manufactured concept and not a natural state. The book examines how U.S. policy and economic interests historically created and intensified the undocumented status for immigrants, particularly from Latin America, to sustain a vulnerable, exploitable workforce while challenging the myths of coming the right way. Professor Chomsky is currently working on an anthology on the state of labor in Boston, looking at different working classes in Boston and how they and their organizations have fared in the past quarter century. She's also working on a research project on settler colonialism, working class history, and the carceral state. I think we'll be hearing quite a bit about that today. Her work is known for being clear, thoughtful, and grounded in real-world issues. It takes a global perspective, a global scope, but also always situated within very particular places and histories. In addition to her teaching and writing, she has been actively involved in supporting immigrant and worker communities, bringing both academic knowledge and practical experience to her work. We're very glad to have you here with us today. Please join me in welcoming Aviva Chomsky.
Thank you all for coming. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It's really exciting to be back here. Extractivism refers to the whole system of an economy based on extraction of resources for export. And it's been especially used to refer to Latin America in the 21st century and the economic project of trying to use extractivism to fund economic development in different ways. But the whole concept of economic development is also tied up with extractivism and critiques of extractivism. But that word is going to go. And the periphery refers to the idea of the way the global economy functions, and different parts of the global economy are integrated with each other, so that if you think about it in terms of colonialism or post or neocolonialism, that the colonial powers extract resources from the colonies are the periphery. The development of the metropolis or the colonial powers, say Britain or the United States, or the post-colonial powers that continue to extract resources from the former colonies, that their economic development is based on their exploitation of the labor and resources of the colonies, and the colonies or post-colonies are still stuck in economic dependency in an economic system, global system that is extracting their resources using new political and economic and military techniques in the post-colonial era, but still reproducing some of the same kind of structures that extract resources and impoverish the periphery. But the region that I'm looking at in Colombia, I call a periphery of a periphery. That is Latin American countries and the theories of economic development coming out of Latin American countries posit Latin America as a whole as a periphery in this system of core and periphery, but Latin American countries have their own peripheries. The country of Colombia has a center and a periphery where this physical geographical, it's not always the physical geographical center, but in the case of Colombia, it is the physical geographical center of Colombia, enriches itself at the expense of extracting resources from the lowland, so the central highlands and highland valleys extract resources and labor and basically exploit the Caribbean, Amazonian, and Pacific lowland peripheries of the country. So I'm using periphery in multiple ways. But anyway, that won't be the title, so you don't have to worry about it. But I just wanted to give you an idea of what the book is about. And it really uses concepts of environmental history to think about this relationship between cores and peripheries and the kinds of social movements and ideas that people have about these places and these processes. So if I could add, after I've submitted the title and we had it all decided, and then I was like working on the fine-tuning the talk, I thought I should have added capitalism to that title, but it's not there, but it will be there in the talk, and it's definitely a part of the whole project that I'm working on. I'm going to talk about 4 things and to sort of talk about what I mean by the concept of climate colonialism and the concept of a global just transition. Climate colonialism, obviously, I'm trying to think about how the colonial system relates to the climate crisis. And the concept of a just transition, that is, how do we create an economic transition away from fossil fuels that will mitigate the climate crisis that we are hurtling ourselves into without slowing down, even though we keep talking about it for several generations now, but we don't do anything about it. We just keep talking about it. How can we create a transition, an energy transition that is both global and just? And often the concept of a just transition is seen in a sort of a narrow sense, like the just transition is, okay, so we have to move away from, mining coal. So how do we have a just transition for the people who work in the coal mine? It's been very much used in the labor movement. So if there's an industry that has to close, well, how do we create a just transition for the workers so that they are not the victims of these decisions that are made for the larger good of society, but are going to be harmful to the workers? But I'm thinking of the just transition beyond just the people who work in the industry, and also thinking about it globally, because climate colonialism obviously is the global issue. So I'm going to talk about the causes of climate change, and how we think about what the causes of climate change is. I'm going to talk about the concept of colonialism and capitalism. What does colonialism and capitalism have to do with each other? I'm going to talk about the concept of climate justice and a view from the South, how climate justice is viewed, is being articulated and worked through. And then I'm going to talk about the concept of a decolonial transition. That is a global just transition, an energy transition. In order to be a just transition, has to be a decolonial transition. This will all make sense by the end, don't worry. So causes of climate change. I think I assume everyone in this room accepts the reality of climate change, and the fact that climate change is caused by greenhouse gas emissions, human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. But I actually think it's much more complicated than that. That is, that's just the surface answer. And part of the question I want to answer, there was a book you didn't mention that I published a couple of years ago called 40 Critical Questions About Climate Justice, that makes the argument that by talking only about greenhouse gas emissions, we don't look at the political and social causes. Like, okay, so we all know that greenhouse gas emissions cause climate change. Why don't we stop emitting greenhouse gases? And it's those social and political questions that I'm more interested in my climate justice book. Like, why do humans keep causing emissions? Like, we know that greenhouse gas that fossil fuel emissions, greenhouse gas emissions cause climate change. So, okay, so we take the first step and say, well, it's burning fossil fuels that cause the emissions. But who is actually burning fossil fuels when we look at it? And so where do we have to focus to start trying to change the system? Depending on where we look, gives us different answers. We could say that big countries that have a lot of people cause more emissions than small countries that have fewer people. And when you look at statistics like the one on the left, which is called the territorial method for measuring emissions, if you look at this pie chart, it looks like China is the big culprit in causing emissions, right? Everybody sees that China. You see the cursor? Yes, you can. China is the biggest emitter. So if we look at this chart, we could say, okay, so the real problem is China. We have to do something about China because it's the one causing more emissions than anyone else. But the problem with thinking that way is that China is a big country. It has so many people in it. And the reason it causes so many emissions is that, so like if you just if you compare the emissions of Rhode Island to the emissions of Texas, obviously Texas is going to have more emissions than Rhode Island because it's huge and Rhode Island is tiny. So measuring emissions per capita, per person, gives us a very different vision of, and the purpose of finding out who's at fault isn't to like guilt trip people, it's to think about how do we have to make changes, what has to change. If you look at per capita emissions, you see that the United States stands out in terms of per capita per person. So for every person in the United States, we consume far more than China, which is way down on the list. Average per capita emissions, 16.5 tons for the United States. And where's China? 7.5 tons for China. So when you see a pie chart like this that tells you how much each country emits, you also need to think about what does that mean in terms of per capita emissions. Because in fact, people in China consume and emit far less than people in the United States. And remember, I don't have to shout. I'm already can drive through it. So just to go back, so maybe the problem isn't big countries, but rather it's rich countries. And this is where colonialism comes in, because how do countries get rich? By extracting countries' resources from countries that get poor. And if you look here again, you see that in fact, rich countries do have much higher per capita emissions. And you also see that rich countries, a lot of them, are settler colonial and colonial countries. We're going to talk more about China as we move ahead, but and some charts put the whole EU together when they tried to do this. But one could also say that the problem isn't just rich countries, it's rich people. And this chart gives us a different way of looking at this, because it looks at the average emissions, it gives them by country, but it looks at the average emissions of the bottom 50% of the population and the top 10% of the population, as well as the average emissions, which is what we looked at in the previous one. And we see that in every country, there's an inequality, where there are some people who consume and emit a lot more, consume a lot more fossil fuels and emit far more greenhouse gases than other people. So in this chart, the United States stands out not only for having the highest per capita emissions, but also for having the greatest level of inequality, and that rich people in the United States are sort of off the chart. The whole chart had to be made bigger to accommodate big consumers in the United States. So you see that even in poor countries, there's some inequality in terms of what the rich and the poor consume and emit. And emissions come from consumption. They come from production and consumption. But that so we can also say that it's really rich people who are the problem, but rich people in rich countries are even more of the problem. Or we could say that if you look at the two charts on the side here, the top one tells us cumulative emissions annually, and the bottom one gives us annual emissions. And it's important to think about cumulative emissions also, because of course what's emitted every year doesn't disappear at the end of the year. We start again at zero. It is added to what was emitted in previous years. So countries that have had high emissions for a really long time, most industrialized countries, the old industrialized countries, which are also the old colonial powers, I'm going to talk about that, have the biggest contribution to cumulative emissions. We're going to look at another chart on that in just a minute. Like if we look at both cumulative emissions here that keep going up and up, and annual emissions here that keep going up and up, and this bottom one goes through 2025. There's always this little dip for COVID when production and consumption went down globally. But that's kind of the only really significant dip we see. We see that it's really in the post-World War II period that we start seeing huge rises, both in cumulative emissions and in annual emissions. Everyone following this? I know it's a lot of numbers, but it's really important to think about how all these things fit together. And this period is called the Great Acceleration, when economic, industrial production and consumption increased globally. And it increased globally in two different ways, three different ways, I should say. Global population growth. So again, it's the number of people who are consuming that uses more and more. Huge increases in consumption in the rich countries. The United States, if you look at US figures, they also go way up after 1950 because of increases in highway building, suburb building, the automobile revolution, all of these things. So we're using a lot more in this country. And in poor countries starting to develop larger middle classes. And this is where China comes in, being a huge country, but that consumed very, very little before really the 1980s or so. But where consumption has and emissions have increased. So this post-World War II period, the Great Acceleration, like we have 100 years of an industrial revolution where emissions hardly go up at all. They do, but barely. And it's after World War II that they shoot up. And the climate crisis starts to become more and more visible. But putting all of these things together, now I'm getting to my favorite word that I left out of the title, I would say that it's plausible to argue that capitalism is the cause of climate change, insofar as capitalism is an economic system based on constantly producing more. That is, capitalism is based on investing capital to increase production and to be able to produce more and then make people consume more, either by convincing people who already consume a lot or enabling people who already consume a lot to consume even more, private planes and yachts and things, or by trying to market useless things like, say, cigarettes by advertising them and trying to convince both rich people and poor people to use more and more of things that they don't need. And so that it's inherent in the very essence of capitalism to seek to maximize, to increase profits off of investments by producing more and increasing consumption. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so now we have all of these charts that we really don't have to go through anymore because we already understand everything in them. Okay, so now my favorite slide. This is like the center of the talk. That was all just background. So colonialism and capitalism. Like, we've been studying capitalism since the 1850s, right? But everybody's still debating what exactly capitalism is and what creates it and how it works. And these are just three things from the last couple of months. Sven Beckert's brand new book on capitalism, A Global History, and then an article in Jacobin, an interview with Vivek Chibber, who's written a lot about capitalism, arguing that colonial plunder didn't cause capitalism, whereas many historians, especially and economists, especially from Latin America, have written that colonialism did cause capitalism. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then an article in Monthly Review critiquing Chibber and saying, could capitalism have thrived without colonialism? A commentary on Vivek Chibber's Jacobin interview. And this is all like just from the last month. So this debate about the relationship between capitalism and colonialism is still very much going on in the public sphere. So a couple of arguments. The first three here are the arguments about the sort of traditional arguments, 20th century arguments about capitalism and colonialism. Like, why could capitalism happen without colonialism, and how did colonialism contribute to the creation of capitalism? One, it goes all the way back to Karl Marx with this idea of primitive accumulation. That is, in order to start building things like factories and developing things like technologies, you need resources. And so in order to start an industrial revolution, you need colonies. And although Karl Marx started developing this, many others since then have said, yes, without the resources of the colonies, and you see that all the big colonial powers, by extracting resources from their colonies, are the ones that were able to start the global industrial revolution in the 1700s and 1800s. And European colonial expansion accompanies the expansion of capitalism. Others have argued that colonial systems also established infrastructures of trade and shipping and banking and finance that led to the development of capitalism. In Britain, as the world's poor colonial power in the 1600s and 1700s, as Spain declines, being the place where the Industrial Revolution started, followed by British colonies in North America and France, like those are the big colonial powers that are importing these resources. And then what I was mentioning before, again, coming out of the post-colonial world, especially Latin America, these concepts of core and periphery, dependency and development, that the process of economic modernization, industrialization of the modern world in the 1800s, 1900s, 20th century, 21st, not really 21st century, because this is 20th century mostly discussions, that capitalism, the economic world system, is based on this unequal exchange between core and periphery, where the colonies are providing natural resources, the industrial powers, the colonial powers, are processing those resources, adding value to them, turning them into sellable products, and then marketing them back to the peripheries as well as in the core. So that's sort of one set of structural explanations of colonialism and capitalism. Another set has to do with labor, because another aspect of capitalism is the way it uses labor. Paid labor, wage labor, the industrial working class, people who are dispossessed from their means of production, that is small farmers, peasants who lose access to their land and who are artisans who lose access to their tools and are forced by political processes that dispossess them of their lands or military processes to migrate to cities and sell their labor because they have nothing to sell except their labor. They can no longer produce vegetables and fruits and milk and shoes and home artisanry and sell them because they've lost control of the land, the workshops, which are taken over by investors who want to make the most profit they can by employing workers at as low wages as they can to manage machines that owners invest in to produce more and more, but that the system of wage labor is key to what makes capitalism capitalism. But many historians who have looked at this have also pointed out that the development of capitalism also relies very heavily on non-wage labor, what's called reproductive labor. That is, workers have to be born, they have to be fed, they have to be educated in some way or other, whether there's a formal school system or not. They have to be raised and taken care of until they're old enough to go work in the factory. And that a lot of that reproductive labor is done through a gendered division of labor. That is, the women are supposed to stay home and do the reproductive labor for no pay so that the man could go and earn a salary. Or it's done in different places. It's done in rural peripheries, either in the colonies or even in the metropole, in rural areas, where workers are born and raised in poverty on small farms. And then they go work in the factories, some of them as seasonal migrant labor. And that every industrial society, from the very beginnings of industry until today, has relied on migrant labor that is reproduced somewhere else without cost to the capitalists who are eventually employing it. Everybody following that? Okay, so reproductive labor and migration, and also slavery, unpaid labor. So we think of capitalism as being a system of wage labor, but it's also always in every stage dependent on unwaged labor, people who are not paid for their labor. Another argument about colonialism and so colonialism is part of how unwaged labor contributes to the reproduction of the wage labor force. Another argument that's made about the working class and colonialism has to do with, and this is if you follow labor history in, say, Britain and the United States over many generations, that the making of the working class, and I'm thinking all the way back here to E.P. Thompson and the making of the English working class, but many, many subsequent labor histories look at these migrant laborers and how they become an industrial working class. When they first enter the factory, wherever it's from, whether it's from rural England or New Hampshire, or whether it's from Mexico or wherever, they don't really like working in factories. And early working class organization, and I say early by recent immigrants, not in the very modern era, but certainly over the course of the 20th century, tends to focus on it's very hard for employers to control workers, to make them work fast, to make them work hard, to infuse them with the value of labor for somebody else, to convince them that it's a good idea. Workers break machines because they don't want to be forced to work harder. They demand shorter hours. They see the boss as the enemy, as the person who is exploiting them. But in places like Britain and the United States, in the colonial powers, this changes over the course of the 20th century. As workers slowly start to adopt consumer values over the subsistence values that think more about survival, community, leisure as their values, and to start to adopt the industrial values of, yes, it's a good idea to get to work early and to work really hard because that way I can earn money and then I can buy more things and have more things. So that part of the development of capitalism is creating a working class that values consumption over subsistence, over the value system of, well, work is just something to be gotten out of the way because it's not just what I need to produce to survive, because my values lie in sharing and community and subsistence and all of these sort of rural values that workers bring with them, rural workers bring with them into the industrial labor force. And there's like a whole really interesting history of US working class history that says, well, this happened in the 1890s. No, it happened in the 1910s. No, it happened in the 1920s. And it's like, it's not really until after World War II that it starts becoming generalized that instead of fighting for shorter hours and to get out of industrial labor, workers are fighting to keep a job. So there's that transition that goes on. But the rising consumption levels are dependent on colonialism because they're dependent on constant influx of resources to be producing more. Studies of peasant societies have looked at the same thing. Eric Wolf's Peasant Wars of the 20th Century. Okay, so on one hand, looking at how the second industrial revolution, which is what refers to what starts in the 1870s, with great increases in technologies, and is also connected to a great increase in the industrial imperialism, or what's called the new imperialism. The French takeovers of Africa, the scramble for Africa, and the infusion of export economies in Latin America, so that there is a huge increase in extraction, also colonial extraction with the second industrial revolution, which is also what enables the formation of a consuming working class in places like Britain and the United States. And this is also neocolonialism, colonialism in Africa, neocolonialism in Latin America, and the concept of peasant wars, where Eric Wolf points out in the late 20th century that Marx thought the industrial working class was going to bring about the revolution and take over the factories, but instead the industrial working class got complacent in the industrialized colonial powers, got complacent through the consumption they were granted, and most of the anti-capitalist revolutions of the 20th century came about in peasant societies, or in societies where the Russian Revolution, the Mexican Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, later the Nicaraguan Revolution, and that those peasant wars came out of the same anti-capitalist kind of values that the early working classes, the more revolutionary early working classes, brought to the industrial labor force. In the Great Acceleration, we see yet another push into more peripheral areas in terms of resource extraction. In the post-World War II period, it's a period of decolonization, but it's also a period of increased neocolonialism and extraction of resources. So the increase in emissions goes along with the increase in extraction of resources. And the concept of colonizing the atmospheric commons, which is yet another way that colonialism is related to capitalism. That is, you need not only resources and labor to create capitalism, you also need access to getting rid of your waste by putting it into the atmosphere. So if we think of the Earth's atmosphere as something that should belong to all of humanity, in fact, the capitalist industrialized countries have colonized it. That is, they have taken more than their share. They've filled it up with greenhouse gases, and everyone on the planet has to suffer the consequences. So that's yet another way that colonialism is inherent and essential to capitalism, is the capacity of the rich to colonize the atmospheric commons. So here we are now in the period of climate crisis, neoliberal economics, extractivism, that is this new 21st century commodity boom that greatly magnifies extractive regimes in Latin America and elsewhere. But along with that, arise in what, and I'm going to talk more about this, called global indigeneity and global peasant movements as some of the main sources of resistance to capitalism in this era that we are living through now. Okay, that's all the theory. Now I'm going to go to Colombia. I know I'm running out of time, but I'll take 5 more minutes to finish. So I want to be sure to leave time for questions. So, okay, so now I'm going to my own work in this peripheral region of Colombia, a Caribbean region in the far north of Colombia, jutting out to the Caribbean Sea along the border of Venezuela, where in this era of the Great Acceleration, the sort of transition from the Great Acceleration to the climate crisis, Exxon, you all have heard of Exxon, right? Oil company, but they also mine coal. Was invited by the Colombian government to build a coal mine in this region called La Guajira, tropical lowland region of Colombia that really was autonomous, indigenous, and unconquered before the 1970s. That's what I mean by peripheral. So it's the periphery of the periphery, but now it's being colonized in the form of resource extraction by a company from the United States. So at the very bottom here, you see the village of Tamaquito, which is an indigenous YU village. The YU are the largest indigenous group in Colombia, but also the least known in a way, because despite having about 300,000 people, they've just been so separated from Colombian national development. There's so much to say about them, but I'm not going to, because I'm only focusing on the climate crisis and global just transition here. This village does not exist anymore. Since 2011, the people have been displaced and the village has been demolished, like many, many villages in this region, to accommodate the construction and expansion of this coal mine. And at the top here, you see the mine itself. It's 40 miles long, several miles wide, a mile deep. This was taken from like an overlook. The company sponsors mine tourism, so they'll take you in and drive you around to see the engineering wonders that they have. And they actually have named their pits after some of the villages that they have displaced that used to be there. So, but this is what the mine looks like. And this is Jairo Dionisio Fuentes Epieriu, the Gobernador Cabildo, the elected authority of the traditional authority of the village. And on a visit to Salem, Massachusetts, which is where I live, where the PowerPoint was until 2014 importing coal from this mine that had displaced Jairo's village. So since 2002, I and other people in Salem and around the world, because the coal is shipped to all of the industrialized countries. It's shipped to Europe, it's shipped to Japan, it's shipped to Israel, it's shipped to the United States. We have a sort of an international solidarity trying to amplify the voices of the communities and demand rights from the mine. So on this visit to Salem, of course, I took Jairo to see the coal pile, and that's the power plant. And we did an interview, and one of the things he said in the interview is, I asked him, so how do things look different to you here from in Colombia? And he said, there, in Colombia, in the rural areas, we live off what we grow. And here, everything has to be purchased. And all of those products come from different places. And the majority come from places where there are indigenous and peasant communities. And to get all these things, they are destroying everything and violating the rights of indigenous and peasant peoples. So he's giving his analysis of global capitalism, colonialism, and capitalism here. And without having read any of the theoreticians who I was referring to in the first part of my talk, it's quite obvious to him how the global capitalist system works and how it relates to the climate crisis. That is, in La Guajira, people are suffering not only from displacement and contamination from the mine itself, loss of water resources, because in many different ways the mine destroys, uses, and contaminates the local water, and it's in a desert region, so the water is very scarce to begin with. But it's also one of the many regions in the planet that is most vulnerable to climate change, both because of its fragile desert environment, its lack of water, the dependence of the people on agriculture and pastoralism. Animals die when there's a drought, crops die when there's a drought, and because of its lack of resources and infrastructure to adapt to climate change. So we talk a lot about adaptation. Adaptation also takes resources. So there's many small island nations and peripheral regions that are the ones that are suffering the most from climate change. So another way that aspect of climate colonialism. There's also a union in the mine, and it's a very militant leftist union that has its own very strong analysis of global capitalism and how it functions and what their position in global capitalism is. And on one of our delegations that we took there, there was a young woman from the Sierra Club who was working on the Beyond Coal campaign of the Sierra Club. You guys don't know what the Sierra Club is? Big U.S. environmental organization. And so they, for several years, were running a campaign called Beyond Coal. And so this young woman asked Jairo, he's also named Jairo, everyone in La Guajira is named Jairo. Jairo Quiroz, who was then the president of the union in the mine, don't you agree that we have to stop mining coal because of the climate crisis? And Jairo answered, if someone from the United States asks me whether we need to stop mining coal, I'll tell you that you're asking the wrong person. Colombia exports 100% of its coal. We're mining this coal for you. And if you say you're going to shift to clean energy, let me tell you that there is no such thing as clean energy. Every form of energy production starts with extraction of non-renewable resources from the earth. The energy demand of the US population has mobilized the search for different sources all over the world. And I would say that it was this comment by Jairo that really got my thinking started on my climate justice book, and the idea that and this was just at the time that the idea of the energy transition, clean energy and green energy was becoming like the environmental cause in the United States. Like, to be an environmentalist is to promote so-called green energy. And I constantly had Jairo's voice in the back of my head. There is no such thing as clean energy. It's about more. Capitalism is the cause of the climate crisis. Yes, fossil fuels, but switching to another form of energy is just going to create new forms of extractivism. Okay. Exactly what's happening in La Guajira. That is, La Guajira is also participating in the green energy revolution. The coal mine is going to close in 2034. And now the region is being taken over by wind farms and copper mines. And people are still being displaced. Their resources are still being extracted for the benefit of other industrialized peoples and places, both in central Colombia and in the United States. So again, there is no such thing as clean energy. But I also wanted to mention something when we talk about a just transition that's really striking in Colombia and how different this is from the United States, because in the United States, when there's talk about closing an industrial facility, the workers are generally against closing the facility. And what they're worried about is their jobs. And there's often disputes between labor organizations and environmental organizations over polluting industries and what should happen to them. This union, for many, many years, has felt that the cause of the communities is their cause. That is, it's a common anti-capitalist. Like, they're the ones being exploited, the workers are being exploited, and the communities are being exploited. And that the indigenous people of Colombia are, like them, victims of capitalist exploitation. So this is from a strike in 2009 during the contract negotiations. Now, strikes in Colombia are very strictly regulated by law, but this was a legal strike during the contract negotiations. And their banner says for health, education, about inequidades, which is like lack of money, lack of funds, a better distribution of the wealth of Cerrejón, that's the name of the mine, and a decent treatment for communities and for contract workers. So the rights of the communities that are being exploited and displaced are really central to the union's goals and ideology. Okay, just a couple more slides. So I wanted to bring up one anti-capitalist proposal for looking at the economy and what kind of economy we could have, and what a global just transition could look like, which is the idea of the donut economy, or the concept of degrowth and a good life for all within planetary boundaries. That the goal of the economy should not be to invest money to produce more to get profit off of your investment, but rather the goal of the economy, a common human goal, should be to create a good life for all within planetary boundaries. The planetary boundaries are the outer green, dark green circle of the donut, which is called the ecological ceiling. That is how much the planet can survive, how much the planet can provide, and how much the planet can provide in terms of resources, how much the planet can take in terms of waste without destroying planetary systems that are necessary for human life. And so the people who put this together, this is a very scientific thing, measured things like fresh water withdrawals, biodiversity loss, air pollution, ozone layer pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, chemical pollution, and measured that in right now in 4 of the planetary boundaries are being exceeded. Like, we are producing and consuming too much, more than the planet can take if we wanted to continue to sustain human life. The social foundation is how much do we need for people to live a good life for all within planetary boundaries. And inside the donut are the things that everybody should have access to within planetary boundaries without exceeding those planetary boundaries in order to live a good life. And those things are both material and social, cultural, political, that everybody on the planet should have. We want an economy that can provide this for everybody. Social equity, political voice, peace and justice, income and work, education, health, food, water, energy is one of the things that people need, but at an amount that everybody can have access to without exceeding planetary boundaries. Networks, housing, gender equality, social equity. And there's some different versions of this that measure different factors, but this is sort of the most accepted version. And when you look at social foundation, the human people are falling short on all of them. That is, we are not meeting the social foundations for everybody on the planet in any of those areas. So our economy is organized all wrong. It's not providing a good life for all, and it's not remaining within planetary boundaries. And instead of just thinking about development means we have to produce more so that more people can produce more and the profit makers can make more profit, we have to think about how can we get everyone within the donut. That should be the goal of the economy rather than producing more. So this model was designed by Northern scientists, but from the global South, as we've seen from some of the quotes that I gave you, some of the very same ideas are emerging in this era of the Great Acceleration, the climate crisis, extractivism, global indigenous movements, etc. So the global just transition has to be indigenous, anti-colonial, and anti-capitalist. Some of the concepts that fit right in with that degrowth model is the concept of buen vivir. Again, that the goal of the economy should not be producing more, but living well. The idea that nature itself has rights. Concepts of plurinationalism, that is transcending the idea of the nation state and national sovereignty, where some are going to exploit others, and recognizing that every state holds many nations, as of course Colombia is one example, and that rather than colonizing ethnic minorities, we should recognize plurinationalism and different forms of radical democracy. And I just want to end, this is the last one, with a couple of quotes from the World People's Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth in Bolivia in April 2010. Instead of all those failed United Nations Council, Congress of Parties meetings, this was like a grassroots bottom-up, indigenous-led meeting with people from over 100 countries and several thousand people who came to this. The capitalist system has imposed on us a logic of competition, progress, and limitless growth. The regime of production and consumption seeks profits without limits, separating human beings from nature and imposing a logic of domination upon nature, transforming everything into commodities: water, earth, the human genome, ancestral cultures, biodiversity, justice, ethics, the rights of peoples, and life itself. You can almost see the donut here as this is coming from the bottom up as well as from the top down. So again, the analysis, developed countries, industrialized countries, colonizers, as the main cause of climate change, in assuming their historical responsibility, that is their cumulative emissions over time that they've already built up, must recognize and honor their climate debt. That is, it's the rich countries that are in debt to poor countries for everything that they have stolen from them, including the atmospheric commons that they have stolen from them. In all of its dimensions as the basis for a just, effective, and scientific solution to climate change. Developed countries must restore to developing countries the atmospheric space that is occupied by their greenhouse gas emissions and colonizing the atmospheric commons. This implies the decolonization of the atmosphere through reduction and absorption of their emissions. So I'm going to end there.